Today we got some actual history about Fanny Kelly from her book Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians, published all the way back in 1871. In this episode, Fanny is able to send a couple of messages to Captain Fisk, who is stationed with a wagon train that has stopped to repair a wagon that had turned over. It is now September of 1864, and Fanny is camped with the Sioux near Marmarth, North Dakota, after being captured back in July in Wyoming near Little Box Elder Creek. As you'll see in this episode, Fanny is able to use deception to send some secret messages to Captain Fisk, perhaps sparing the wagon train from wide-scale destruction. One of the occupations given me while resting in the villages between war times was to prepare the bark of a red willow called killikinnick for smoking instead of tobacco. They discovered that I could sing, and groups of idle warriors would gather around me before the tent, urging me to sing as I worked, a dreary, dreary task, chanting to please my Indian companions while I rubbed and prepared the bark of willow, my heart ready to burst with grief. On the 5th of September they went to battle, and surprised a portion of Captain Fisk's men passing and escorting an immigrant train, 14 of whom were killed, and captured 2 wagons loaded with whiskey, wines, and valuable articles. There was a quantity of silverware and stationery also taken by them. Among the articles captured and brought into the camp were a number of pickles in glass jars, which the Indians tasted. The result was comical in the extreme, for there is nothing that an Indian abhors more than a strong acid. The faces they made can be imagined but not described. Thinking they might be improved by cooking, they placed the jars in the fire, when of course they exploded, very much to their disgust for the white man's kettles. I could hear the firing plainly, and when they returned that night in triumph, bringing with them the plundered stores, they committed every description of extravagant demonstration. In the wild orgies which followed, they mocked and groaned in imitation of the dying, and went through a horrid mimicry of the butchery they had perpetrated. They determined to go out again, and capture a quantity of horses corralled in the neighborhood, and sweep the train and soldiers with wholesale massacre. But they feared the white man's cannon, and deliberated on means of surprising by ambush, which is their only idea of warfare. Indians are not truly brave, though they are vain of the name of courage. Cunning, stealth, strategy, and deceit are the weapons they use in attack. They endure pain because they are taught from infancy that it is cowardly to flinch, but they will never stand to fight if they can strike secretly and escape. Fearing the cannon, yet impatient for the spoil almost within view, the Indians waited for 3 days for the train to move on and leave them free to attack. For 2 days I implored and begged on my knees to be allowed to go with them, but to no avail. At last I succeeded in inducing them to allow me to write, as they knew I understood the nature of correspondence, and they procured for me the necessary appliances and dictated a letter to Captain Fisk, assuring him that the Indians were weary of fighting, and advising him to go on in peace and safety. Knowing their malicious designs, I set myself to work to circumvent them, and although the wily chief counted every word dictated, and as they were marked on paper, I contrived, by joining them together and condensing the information I gave, to warn the officer of the perfidious intentions of the Indians, and tell him briefly of my helpless and unhappy captivity. The letter was carefully examined by the chief, and the number of its apparent words recounted. At length, appearing satisfied with its contents, he had it carried to a hill in sight of the soldiers' camp, and stuck on a pole. In due time the reply arrived, and again my ingenuity was tasked to read the answer corresponding with the number of words that would not condemn me. The captain's real statement was that he distrusted all among the Indians, and had great reason to. On reading Captain Fisk's words that seemed to crush my already awakened hopes, my emotion overcame me. Having told the Indians that the captain doubted their friendliness, and explained the contents of the letter as I thought best, the next day I was entrusted with the task of writing again, to solemnly assure the soldiers of the faith and friendship professed. Again, I communicated with them and this time begged them to use their field glasses, and that I would find an excuse for standing on the hills in the afternoon, that they might see for themselves that I was what I represented myself to be, a white woman held in bondage. The opportunity I desired was gained, and to my great delight I had a chance of standing so as to be seen by the men of the soldiers' camp. I had given my own name in every communication. As soon as the soldiers saw that it was truly a woman of their own race, and that I was in the power of their enemies, the excitement of their feelings became so great that they desired immediately to rush to my rescue. A gentleman belonging to the train generously offered $800 for my ransom, which was all the money he had, and the noble manly feeling displayed in my behalf did honor to those who felt it. There was not a man in the train who was not willing to sacrifice all he had for my rescue. Captain Fisk restrained all hasty demonstrations, and even went so far as to say that the first man who moved in the direction of the Indian camp should be shot immediately, his experience enabling him to know that a move of that kind would result fatally to both them and the captive. The Indians found a box of crackers saturated with water, and eating of them sickened and died. I afterward learned that some persons with the train who had suffered the loss of dear relatives and friends in the massacre of Minnesota, and who had lost their all, had poisoned the crackers with strychnine, and left them on one of their camping grounds without the captain's knowledge. The Indians told me afterwards that more had died from eating bad bread than from bullets during the whole summer campaign. Captain Fisk deserves great credit for his daring and courage with his meager supply of men against so large an army of Indians. After assurance of my presence among them, Captain Fisk proceeded to treat quietly with the Indians on the subject of a ransom, offering to deliver in their village 3 wagon loads of stores as a price for their prisoner. To this the deceitful creatures pretended to readily agree, and the tortured captive, understanding their tongue, heard them making fun of the credulity of white soldiers, who believed their promises. I had the use of a field glass from the Indians, and with it I saw my white friends, which almost made me wild with excited hope. Knowing what the Indians had planned, and dreading lest the messengers should be killed, as I knew they would be if they came to the village, I wrote to Captain Fisk of the futility of ransoming me in that way, and warned him of the treachery intended against his messengers. No tongue can tell or pen describe those terrible days, when seemingly lost to hope, and surrounded by drunken Indians, my life was in constant danger. Nights of horrible revelry passed, when forlorn and despairing I lay listening only half-consciously to the savage mirth and wild exultation. To no overtures would the Indians listen, declaring I could not be purchased at any price. They were determined not to part with me. Captain Fisk and his companions were sadly disappointed in not obtaining my release, and after a hopeless attempt he made known the fact of my being a prisoner, spreading the news far and wide. His expeditions across the plains had always been successful, and the Indians, knowing him to be very brave, gave him the name of the great chief who knows no fear, and he richly deserves the appellation, for the expeditions were attended with great danger. The reports of his various expeditions have been published by the government, and are very interesting, giving a description of the country. In September the rains were very frequent, sometimes continuing for days. This may not seem serious to those who have always been accustomed to a dwelling and a good bed, but to me, who had no shelter and whose shrinking form was exposed to the pitiless storm, and naught but the cold ground to lie upon, bringing the pains and distress of rheumatism, it was a calamity hard to bear, and I often prayed fervently to God to give me sweet release in a flight to the lands where there are no storms. Soon the winter would be upon us, and the cold and sleet and stormy weather would be more difficult to bear. Would I be so fortunate, would heaven be so gracious as to place me in circumstances where the wintry roads could not chill, nor make me suffer. My heart seemed faint at the thought of what was before me, for hope was lessening as winter approached. Well do I remember my thoughts and feelings when first I beheld the mighty and beautiful prairie on Cannonball River. With what singular emotions I beheld it for the first time. I could compare it to nothing but a vast sea, changed suddenly to earth with all its heaving, rolling billows. Thousands of acres lay spread before me like a mighty ocean, bounded by nothing but the deep blue sky. What a magnificent sight! A sight that made my soul expand with lofty thoughts, and its frail tenements sink into utter nothingness before it. Well do I remember my sad thoughts, and the turning of my mind upon the past, as I stood alone upon a slight rise of ground, and overlooked miles upon miles of the most lovely, the most sublime scene I had ever beheld. Wave upon wave of land stretched away on every hand, covered with beautiful green grass, and the blooming wildflowers of the prairie. Occasionally I caught glimpses of wild animals, while flocks of birds of various kinds and beautiful plumage, skimming over the surface here and there, alighting or darting upward from the earth, added life and beauty and variety to this most enchanting scene. It had been a beautiful day, and the sun was now just burying himself in the far-off ocean of blue, and his golden rays were streaming along the surface of the waving grass and tinging it with a delightful hue. Occasionally some elevated point caught and reflected back his rays to the one I was standing upon, and it would catch for a moment his fading rays, and glow like a ball of golden fire. Slowly he took his diurnal farewell, as if loath to quit a scene so lovely, and at last hid himself from my view, beyond the western horizon. I stood and marked every change with that poetical feeling of pleasant sadness, which a beautiful sunset rarely fails to awaken in the breast of the lover of nature. I noted every change that was going on, and yet my thoughts were far, far away. I thought of the hundreds of miles that separated me from the friends that I loved. I was recalling the delight with which I had, when a little girl, viewed the farewell scenes of day from so many romantic hills and lakes and rivers, rich meadows, mountain gorge and precipice, and the quiet hamlets of my dear native land so far away. I fancied I could see my mother move to the door with a slow step and heavy heart, and gaze with yearning affection toward the broad, the mighty west, and sigh, wondering what had become of her lost child. I thought and grew more sad as I thought, until tears filled my eyes. Mother, what a world of affection is comprised in that single word! How little do we, in the giddy round of youthful pleasure and folly, heed her wise counsels! How lightly do we look upon the zealous care with which she guides our otherwise erring feet, and watches with feelings which none but a mother can know, the gradual expansion of our youth to the riper years of discretion. We may not think of it then, but it will be recalled to our minds in after years, when the gloomy grave or a fearful living separation has placed her far beyond our reach, and her sweet voice of sympathy and consolation for the various ills attendant upon us sounds in our ears no more. How deeply then we regret 1,000 deeds that we have done contrary to her gentle admonitions. How we sigh for those days once more, that we may retrieve what we have done amiss, and make her kind heart glad with happiness. Alas! Once gone, they can never be recalled, and we grow mournfully sad with a bitter reflection. "Oh, my mother!" I cried aloud, "my dear, beloved mother! Would I ever behold her again? Should I ever return to my native land? Would I find her among the living? If not, heavens, what a sad, what a painful thought!" And instantly I found my eyes swimming in tears, and my frame trembling with nervous agitation. But I would hope for the best. Gradually I became calm. Then I thought of my husband, and what might be his fate. It was sad at best, I well knew, and lastly, though I tried to avoid it, I thought of Mary, sweet, lost, but dearly beloved Mary. I could see her gentle features, I could hear her plaintive voice, soft and silvery as running waters, and sighed a long, deep sigh as I thought of her murdered. Could I never behold her again? No, she was dead, perished by the cruel, relentless Indian. Silence brooded over the world. Not a sound broke the solemn repose of nature. The summer breeze had rocked itself to rest in the willow buffs, and the broad-faced familiar moon seemed alive and toiling as it climbed slowly up a cloudless sky, passing starry sentinels whose nightly challenge was lost in vast vortices of blue as they paced their ceaseless round in the mighty camp of constellations. With my eyes fixed upon my gloomy surroundings of tyranny, occasionally a slip of moonshine silvered the ground, I watched and reflected. O hallowed days of my blessed girlhood, they rise before me now like holy burning stars breaking out in a stormy howling night, making the blackness blacker still. The short, happy springtime of my life, so full of noble aspirations and glowing hopes of my husband's philanthropic schemes, of charitable projects in the future. We had planned so much for the years to come, when prosperous and happy, we should be able to distribute some happiness among those whose fate might be mingled with ours, and in the pursuit of our daily avocations, we would find joy and peace. But alas for human hopes and expectations! It is thus with our life. We silently glide along, little dreaming of the waves which will so soon sweep over us, dashing us against the rocks, or stranding us forever. We do not dream that we shall ever wreck until the greater wave comes over us, and we bend beneath its power. If some mighty hand could unroll the future to our gaze, or set aside the veil which enshrouds it, what pictures would be presented to our trembling hearts? No, let it be as the All-Wise hath ordained, a closed-up tomb, only revealed as the events occur, for could we bear them with the fortitude we should, if they were known beforehand? Shrinking from it, we would say, let the cup pass from me. In October we were overtaken by a prairie fire. At this season of the year the plants and grass parched by a hot sun are ready to blaze in a moment if ignited by the least spark, which is often borne on the wind from some of the many campfires. With frightful rapidity we saw it extend in all directions, but we were allowed time to escape. The Indians ran like wild animals from the flames, uttering yells like demons, and great walls of fire from the right hand and from the left advanced toward us, hissing, crackling, and threatening to unite and swallow us up in their raging fury. We were amid calcined trees which fell with a thundering crash, blinding us with clouds of smoke, and were burned by the showers of sparks which poured upon us from all directions. The conflagration assumed formidable proportions. The forest shrunk up in the terrible grasp of the flames, and the prairie presented one sheet of fire, in the midst of which the wild animals, driven from their dens and hiding places by this unexpected catastrophe, ran about mad with terror. The sky gleamed with blood-red reflection, and the impetuous wind swept both flames and smoke before it. The Indians were terrified in the extreme on seeing around them the mountain heights lighted up like beacons to show the entire destruction. The earth became hot, while immense troops of buffalo made the ground tremble with their furious tread, and their bellowings of despair would fill with terror the hearts of the bravest men. Everyone was frightened, running about the camp as if struck by insanity. The fire continued to advance majestically, as it were, swallowing up everything in its way, preceded by countless animals of various kinds, that bounded along with howls of fear, pursued by the scourge which threatened to overtake them at every step. A thick smoke laden with sparks was already passing over the camp. 10 minutes more and all would be over with us, I thought, when I saw the squaws pressing the children to their bosoms. The Indians had been deprived of all self-possession by the presence of our imminent peril, the flames forming an immense circle, of which our camp had become the center. But suddenly the strong breeze which up to that moment had lent wings to the conflagration suddenly subsided, and there was not a breath of air stirring. The progress of the fire had slackened. Providence seemed to grant us time. The camp presented a strange aspect. On bended knee and with clasped hands I prayed fervently. The fire continued to approach with its vanguard of wild beasts. The Indians, old and young, male and female, began to pull up the grass by the roots all about the camp, then lassoed the horses and hobbled them in the center, and in a few moments a large space was cleared. Some of the Indians went to the extremity of the space where the grass had been pulled up and formed a pile of grass and plants with their feet. Then with their flint they set fire to the mass and thus caused fire to fight fire, as they called it. This was done in different directions. A curtain of flames rose rapidly around us, and for some time the camp was almost concealed beneath a vault of fire. It was a moment of intense and awful anxiety. By degrees the flames became less fierce, the air purer, the smoke dispersed, the roaring diminished, and at length we were able to recognize each other in this horrible chaos. A sigh of relief burst from every heart. Our camp was saved. After the first moments of joy were over, the camp was put in order, and all felt the necessity of repose, after the terrible anxieties of the preceding hours, and also to give the ground time enough to cool, so that it might be traveled over by people and horses. The next day we prepared for departure. Tents were folded and packages were placed upon the ponies, and our caravan was soon pursuing its journey under the direction of the chief, who rode in advance of our band. The appearance of the prairie was much changed since the previous evening. In many places the black and burnt earth was a heap of smoking ashes. Scarred and charred trees still standing displayed their saddening skeletons. The fire still roared at a distance, and the horizon was still obscured by smoke. The horses advanced with caution over the uneven ground, constantly stumbling over the bones of animals that had fallen victims to the embrace of the flames. The ground trodden by the horses was composed of round pebbles, which slipped from under their feet, augmenting the difficulty of the march, which was rendered still more toilsome to me by the rays of the sun falling directly upon my uncovered head and face. The day passed away thus, and aside from the fatigue which oppressed me, the day's journey was unbroken by any incident. At evening we again camped in a plain, absolutely bare, but in the distance we could see an appearance of verdure, affording great consolation, for we were about to enter a spot spared by the conflagration. At sunrise next morning we were on the march toward this oasis in the desert. So that's it for this episode from Fanny Kelly's narrative. She showed great ingenuity in helping to alert Captain Fisk and save the wagon train. She also reflected on how much she missed her family, particularly her mother, who she could see looking west toward her daughter who is captive in an Indian camp. She also survived another dangerous situation when the wildfire broke out and nearly burned down the Hunkpapa Sioux camp. To give a little more information from the perspective of Captain Fisk's men and the wagon train they were escorting west, I will now read a short section from this book, Encyclopedia of Indian Wars by Gregory F. Michno. This book was published more recently back in 2003. September 2nd, 1864, Marmarth, North Dakota. Captain James L. Fisk was leading 200 immigrants and gold seekers in 88 wagons to the mines of Montana. At Fort Rice on the Missouri River, Fisk begged for an escort, and 47 soldiers led by a Lieutenant Smith of Company A, Dakota Cavalry, headed out with the train on August 23rd. Brigadier General Alfred Sully was not happy to be responsible for yet another group of immigrants and feared trouble. On September 2nd, about 130 miles west of Fort Rice, Sully's fear was realized in the gully of Deep Creek, about 12 miles east of present-day Marmarth, North Dakota. A wagon turned over, and 2 other wagons stopped to assist. Leaving 9 soldiers behind as guards while repairs were made, the rest of the train moved on. Soon Sitting Bull with 100 Hunkpapa Sioux attacked the isolated wagons, cutting down most of the defenders in the first few minutes. One soldier did manage to put a bullet into Sitting Bull's hip, and White Bull and Jumping Bull pulled their chief to safety. A mile ahead on the trail, Fisk and the others heard the gunfire. After corralling the train, Fisk hurried back with 50 soldiers and civilian volunteers. A scout, Jefferson Diltz, met one of the survivors running toward the wagon train. By the time Diltz reached the scene, the Hunkpapas were looting the wagons. Recklessly, Diltz charged. Blasting away with a carbine and a six-gun, he shot 6 Hunkpapas before reining his horse around. He did not retreat fast enough, however, and took 3 arrows in the back. Fisk and the rest of the rescuers, running square into the Hunkpapas, quickly forded up and fought until sunset. After dark, they crept back to the corralled wagons. The Indians did not show up. 10 soldiers and 2 civilians, including Dilts, were killed. 6 Hunkpapas were killed, most or all by Dilts, and Sitting Bull was wounded. From the wagons, the Hunkpapas looted rifles and 4,000 bullets, plus liquor and cigars. The wagon train continued a few miles the next morning, but the Indians attacked again. Fisk corralled the wagons again, and the soldiers and immigrants built sod walls for cover, naming their fortification Fort Dilts, after the brave scout. They stayed holed up for several days, suffering no casualties. On September 5th, over 400 Indians probed the earthworks, but the defenders held out. That night, Lieutenant Smith and 13 men crept out and rode to Fort Rice for help. The train members waited at Fort Dilts for 2 more weeks before an angry Sully dispatched 900 men to rescue them. On September 20th, the Fisk party was escorted back to Fort Rice. So that's it for this episode. According to Fanny Kelly, she played a critical role in saving this wagon train from wide-scale destruction. It's unclear how important her letter was, but it probably didn't hurt. Fanny mentioned that the Hunkpapa Sioux who were attacking the wagon train feared the white man's cannon, and the North Dakota State Historical Society says that the soldiers had to use a howitzer to clear the way in front of the wagon train. Today there is a marker place where Fort Dilts once stood. The fort was only made out of sod. The men cut sod and stacked it to a height of 6.5 feet in a defensive perimeter that was 300 feet in diameter, and the siege lasted for about 16 days total. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is unworthy of history channels on TV, and because we are unworthy to stand in the shoes of some of the people we talk about on this channel. Stay tuned to this channel for more stories about Fanny Kelly's captivity and other actual history. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.